We're now on Daf Chaf Amid Beis. V'lo b'bigdei tzeva shel isha. You shouldn't look at colored clothing of a woman, and we'll see it applies even if she's not wearing it, just that you can identify that it's her clothing. V'lo b'chamor, v'lo b'chamor, v'lo b'chazir, v'lo b'chazira, v'lo b'ofos b'zman shenistokim zel lezeh. So when animals are mating, male and female, even in the case of birds, you're not allowed to look upon them, gaze upon them, because it might lead to wrong thoughts. Now, the concept of malay ayin is a reference to the malach hamavis. As we'll soon see, the malach hamavis is full of eyes. So let's say, for example, you're surrounded by forbidden sights that you're not allowed to look at, but you can't help seeing them. Still, he may not deliberately gaze upon them, because the Malach HaMoves is described as full of eyes. Okay, this is way beyond our pay scale, but whatever that means. In any event, we're back to a question here about Reb Shimon Gamliel, who gazed upon the beauty of a woman. And now we take a little interlude about the nature of the Malach HaMoves. Hopefully you and I won't have a very close meeting with him. He's full of eyes. And when a person is deathly ill, Omed Me'al Rashosov, the Malach HaMoves stands over the head of this ill person. Charbo Shlufa Biyado, right? And Tipa Shel Mora Tluyabo. So he's got a drop of poison, and it's at the tip of the cherev, of the sword. Kevan Shechola Ros, so now the Chola catches a sight of this fearful, fear-inspiring Malach HaMoves, Mizdadzea. He starts shuddering. Uposeach Piv, and he opens his mouth. He can't control it. Vizarko L'toch Piv, and Mimenu. The drop of apparently poison that comes to the tip of the cherev of the Malach HaMoves falls into the mouth of the Chola, and he dies. Mimenu Masriach, and this little drop of, shall we say, poisonous liquid that comes from the cherev of the shoulder blood, that's going to cause the decomposition of the body after its death. Mimenu Pana Marikos, and the face of the deceased will turn a very sad kind of color. He doesn't say exactly, what color it is. It's kind of greenish, yellowish, reddish. I don't know what it is. In any event, we're back to Reb Shimon Gamliel. Why did he gaze at this woman? But Ishmael called over. And the Gemara answer is Keren Zovis Havoy. What happened is that she was coming from this side. There was a corner. He was coming from that side. And before he could even notice that a beautiful woman was coming upon him, she emerged simultaneously from these alleyways. Suddenly he's looking at her face to face. Had he been aware that she was approaching, he certainly would have avoided it and averted his gaze, but he had no choice, because out of nowhere, without any warning, she suddenly stands in front of him face to face. V'lo b'bigdei tzeva shel isha, Rabbi Yehuda Masha afilu shtuchim al gabi kosel, right? So she's not wearing these colored garments, but he's looking at them. Amra Papa ubimakir ba'alehem, but it only applies if he knows who owns these begodim. So he knows that these are so and so's colored begodim, and even though they're spread out on a wall or on wherever they're spread out, nevertheless, and she's not wearing them, but nevertheless he has thoughts about her. Omar Rava, Dekonami, I'm going to prove what you said from a brisa. The Ketani v'lo b'big de tseva shel isha, lo Ketani v'lo b'big de tziv'onim, but rather it says shel isha. In other words, these are colorful clothing of a specific woman, and he knows how to identify the owner of these begadim. Shmamino. Omar Rav Chizda Hani Mili Be'atike. Aval B'chadete Leslan Ba. Rav Chizda is going to prove that this prohibition about gazing at the colored garments of Miss So-and-so only applies if she's worn these garments in the past. If they're brand new and she owns them, right? She has a Kabbalah, she paid for these begadim, but nevertheless she never wore them, then it has to be mutter. Why? Dilo Temacha, you don't agree with the Anan Mona Lashpure Hechi Avinon Hakam Stakil. Now, it seems that in the days of the Talmud, when they completed manufacturing a garment, they sent it for laundering. It wasn't like pure white and clean. And the question is, if the Jews, laundered, they were in that business and they laundered new garments that belonged to a woman, and some of them were colored, how could they do that? The answer is that you're allowed to gaze at a woman's clothing, women's apparel, if the woman who owns the apparel never wore them. They're brand new. The Gemara says this is not a good proof. Hadiyama Rabbi Yehuda min b'mino mutal lahachnis kimchol b'shvol feres. Okay. Oh, okay. So now the Gemara is attacking Rav Chizda's proof based on a very important halachic principle that has tremendous ramifications, halacha l'maisa, in many different areas, called be'avodotayu Torah, which means, if we translate it literally, but it really goes way beyond the literal translation, it means that a person is preoccupied in his malacha. In other words, he's being paid to do a job. He's a craftsman, he's a worksman, and he doesn't get distracted by other thoughts. For example, in the halacha of a woman being checked by a gynecologist, a male gynecologist. And again, it's a twofold question. Does she have to worry about his thinking about her? Does he have to worry about his, looking at her private parts and so forth and so on? So the halacha, based on this Gemara that we're learning now, says b'avodotayu Torah. Or, for example, the question of yichud in the case of a woman who takes a job, she's employed in a place where there are men, and sometimes there's only one man around. She gets paid for overtime. And does she have to be afraid that he might do something this? So again, I don't know, today it might be different, but in the old days they said b'avodotayu Torah. And a similar psak in Rav Moshe Feinstein's head to buy milk, Elmhurst milk, because a person is not going to risk his umnus and bring in cows, pig's milk. Anyway, so the Gemara says the following, the fact that we are allowed to launder the new garments of a woman, that has nothing to do with the fact that she didn't wear them. That per se would still be prohibited, but min b'mino mutal lahachnis kichol b'shvol feres hamikstakel v'latayu tayu nochnan v'atayu Torah. In the case of a professional breeder, meaning he breeds a male animal, mates a male animal with a female animal, that's how he breeds the animals, brings new animals into this world. He's allowed to do so, even though we said before you're not allowed to gaze at a male-female mating, even amongst even animals. But here, b'avodotayu Torah, he's doing it professionally. That's how he makes his living. And he's going to get involved in mating. Even if he has to put the male and the female mamish together, he's allowed to do that. And here too, we're going to say that laundering clothing will not lead a person who's laundering the clothing to think, immoral thoughts because he is Bavarutayu Torah, he is completely preoccupied with his work. Omar Mar, Mimenu Mes. From that drop at the tip of the cherev of the Malcham Avos, he dies. Nemo pliga de Avoda Shmuel. Is this against the father of Shmuel, the Omer Avoda Shmuel? Omali Malcham Avos. I got a direct word from the Malcham Avos. Ilo de chayshina liakara de briasa havi parana beishchita kibehem. He says the following. Even though I am in charge of taking people's lives, that's my job as the angel of death, but nevertheless, I have to have some respect for the physical body, which is Tzelem Elokim, which is the creation of Almighty God. But if not for that, says the angel of death, I would rip the guy apart like you slaughter an animal. In other words, I would sort of like cut him with my sword at the throat. But I'm not going to do that because I'm choshesh liyakara debriyos. Anyway, it seems to imply that the angel of death could kill by slaughtering. He doesn't need poison. And the Gemara answers, Dilma he tipa machat chalu l'simon. Maybe the Gemara combines these two, that the drop that comes out of the cherev is going to slaughter the person who has to die. And from this drop of poison, the body decomposes. Messiah Leila Reb Chanina Bar Kahana, this is a support. The Omer of Chanina Bar Kahana Omri Libe Rav. They told me at the Academy of Rav, Harotzish Lo Yasriach Meso, a person who wants to see that his deceased should not rot in the grave, Yafchenu al Panav. He should turn the corpse on its face. The Gemara is going to reject this, but what the Gemara is saying right now is that if you turn a person on his face, that poison that killed the person because it went into his mouth, now it won't spread throughout his body, and therefore that poisonous thing, which would normally decay, but since you turned him over, the drop of poison will now fall to the ground rather than spread throughout his body. Oh, so when I said before that we really reject this, what I had in mind is the Yavitz. Yavitz was Rav Yaakov Emden. He lived about 5 centuries ago, and he writes that what the Gemara is talking about is a person who's still alive. He hasn't yet died. He's close to death, and then you turn him over on his face. However, he says that Lamaisa, you're not allowed to do this. I mean, it sounds like a great idea to prevent the body from decay. Just turn over the body before he expires. But says the Yavitz, Allah Lamaisa, you can't do that. Why? Because whenever a body is in the throes of death, you're not allowed to touch the body. Don't tamper with it. Don't move it. Any movement could speed up his death. To be called the immoral thoughts that a person has by day are going to have an impact on him. That'll be motzi Zara levatola. He'll come to Tuma, which is called Keri, at night, because of the thoughts that he had during the day. So apparently the Gemara holds that if you have thoughts during the day that arouse a person, they will cause him to experience a seminal emission at night. And you're not allowed to cause hotzas zera levatol. Now there's a tshuva Rav Moshe Feinstein about whether or not you're allowed to think thoughts about your own wife. If you know that you're going to be able to consummate with actual relations with your wife, that's one thing. But if you're not going to be able to do that, then too much focus in your thought on the body of your wife during the day might cause a seminal emission at night. Okay, we're about to learn a brisa which might qualify, I don't know, as the most famous brisa in all of Shas. And who made this brisa famous? None other than Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, who lived about 5 centuries ago in Italy and wrote, again, he wrote many, many books. Many of them he wrote as a youngster when he was still in the teens. But this one is called the Mesilas Yesharim, and we're all familiar with this. So that Mesilas Yesharim is an analysis of the following brisa. Mikan Omer Pinchas ben Yair, Torah Mevil Lidei Zehirus. So we could read through this whole brisa very quickly, but let's make a few comments as we go along. We have something called Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. We have something called Zehirus. Now, the simple pshat in the word Zehirus means to be very careful, almost to go beyond the letter of the law, which makes sense as we saw before, to make sure and guarantee that you won't sin. A person who's an Amoretz, who's not familiar with the law, does not come to Zehirus. He cannot possibly achieve Zehirus because he doesn't even realize what he's allowed and what he's not allowed to do. However, apparently, the Mesilas Yesharim takes a different twist based on Rashi, that the word Zehirus here doesn't mean being careful to avoid chas v'shalom, a violation of the Torah, but rather it means heedfulness. What does heedfulness mean? And therefore Zehirus. It means a desire to heed the will of God. So the more that you learn Torah and you dedicate yourself to study Torah, which is the chachma, the wisdom, the ratzon, the will of God that's embodied in the Torah, the more you are heedful to try to do what you want, what you possibly can to fulfill the will of God. Then it says, Zehirus Mevili de Zerizus. Now, once again, if you ask me what the word Zerizus means, in the fancy English it's called alacrity, which means Zerizus Makdimim L'mitzvahs. To be a Zariz means to move as quickly as you can and take advantage without delay of the opportunities to fulfill the will of God. However, once again, I'm outvoted by Rashi and others who interpret the word zerizus, to refer to diligence. And this is the way we defined zehirus, but here we're talking about zerizus. They define zerizus as zehirus, as being very careful and being proactive to make all the effort in the world to avoid sin. And zerizus mevili de nekiyus. Now, what is nekiyus? So remember, I quoted to you the Yavitz, Rav Yaakov Emden before, and Rav Yaakov Emden says that we should translate nekiyus literally as cleanliness, as bodily cleanliness, which means apparently that someone who's very refined by the Torah, because he is so careful heeding the Torah, he will eventually reach this level of cleanliness, physical cleanliness, because he's concerned for the body. As we said before, the body is Tselem Elokim. So this is a mark of refinement. However, if we leave out the Yavitz, then the simple pshat in cleanliness is a spiritual cleanliness, not a physical cleanliness. And your nefesh is considered clean because of your avoiding your diligence in avoiding any sort of violation of the prohibitions of the Torah. So once you navigate through, any sort of yetzer hara, any sort of desire for sin, and you escape the pull of desire, then he is clean, so to speak. He no longer has, self-interest to want to do this, X, Y, or Z. Then we get to Nikiyas Mevil de Precious. Now, again, this is a very profound discussion about Precious. I would almost be tempted to say it's a machlokas between what we call Chasidus today. I mean, not to confuse with the Chasidus of Pinchas ben Yair that's coming around the bend here in this place, but Chasidim meaning from the Besht and on. Although I have to admit that even within the shining luminaries of the Hasidic world, the great, whether it be the Baal Tanya, whether it be the Besht himself, whether it be Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, all of them were very, very into Precious. I mean, the Precious of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov is mind-boggling. I mean, basically fasting the whole week, whatever it is. But here, the idea of Precious is somewhat antithetical to Chassidus because Chassidus puts the emphasis on elevating that which is physical to the spiritual level. But Precious here might be understood as a very, very high level beyond the level of you and I. This is not our Precious. This is the Precious or asceticism, if you will, asceticism, I should say, of someone who's on a very, very high level, and he denies himself the pleasures of this world, even permitted pleasures. So we're talking about a level of a mindset. If you ever heard of the Chachmei Ashkenaz, the ascetics of Ashkenaz, that would roll themselves in the snow. A little bit of it had an influence in the Muslim movement of Navardik, if you ever heard of Navardik. And we're talking about asceticism which purifies the soul, but only if you reach that level. If you prava Precious and you're not ready for that. I mean, the Ramban, quoting Rashi, says that Kedoshim Tiyu means Prusha. And the hashkafa here is that the more you enjoy of this world, the less you'll enjoy of the next world. I mean, that's a whole different perspective or Weltanschauung than what we're used to. In any event, Precious Mevili de Tara, that I understand, right? From asceticism you reach purity. Tara Mevili de Chassidus. Chassidus means that you are very, very careful. It's like you do Chesed Hashem, and you say, everything I do, I want to do for the sake of God, and you're Poresh and you're Tahar, and you reach levels of Chasidus Mevili de Anova. Now, according to this presentation of the Brisa of Pinchas ben Yair, it seems that we rise to a higher level from Chasidus in order to get to Anova, meaning Anova is very, very challenging. I mean, we've gone through all these levels of we'll say Zahirus and Zrizus and Nikius and Precious, Tara, and so forth and so on, until finally we get to the level of Anova. I mean, Moshe Rabbeinu is called the Adav, we call Adav. And from Anova we climb to the highest level, which is Yiras Chet. So it would seem that we might say that Chasidus, which is going to project a person to Anova, which is the same as projecting him to the next level, which means Yiras Chet, that's really Chasidus is the highest level you can reach, because that's going to project you beyond that. And Yiras Chet mevil de Kedusha, Kedusha mevil de Ruach HaKodesh, Ruach HaKodesh mevil de Tchis HaBeisim, and that's where Rav Pinchas Ben Yair ends. He doesn't tell you what's beyond Tchiyas HaMesim. So the Brisa says, Chasidus Gedola Mikulam, the highest level that you can achieve from this whole pyramid is Chasidus. Shenemar, based on a pasuk in Yeshayahu Hanavi, I believe, which says, "Oz di barta b'chazon l'chasidech." Upliga de Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, di Omar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Anova Gedola Mikula. So even though we have in our Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair that Hasidus is going to bring you to Anova, and the Brisa says that according to Pinchas Ben Yair, Hasidus is the highest level, and after that you just projected beyond. But Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi disagrees with the Brisa, and he holds no. The level that you want to achieve that's going to project you to the highest levels of Ruach HaKodesh has to come after Hasidus with Hanov. And how do we know this? Shenemar, and this is a pasuk in Yeshaya. So I'm sorry, I made a mistake. The previous pasuk, Ozli Bar, that was a pasuk in Tehillim. Anova is a pasuk here in Yeshaya. Ruach Hashem Elokim Olai. The spirit of Hashem resides on me. Yan Moshach Hashem Osi Levaser Anovim. Anovim is the highest level. He has anointed me to bring tidings of redemption to the humble ones. Chasidim lo nemar ela anovim. L'mato sha'anova gedola mikula. Okay, now we go back to the Mishnah. Ein mochlem, we don't sell to idol worshippers plants that are attached to the ground because of lo sichonim, it's karka. Toner Rabbanan learned to the Brisa, mochlem lahem ilon almanas lakutz v'kotzeitz divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is liberal and permits you to sell a plant to an idol worship on the condition that he'll cut down the plant. And we can rely on that condition that the idol worshiper will fulfill that condition. But Rabbi Meir, you've got to cut it down. And after you chop down the tree, then you can sell him the wood of the tree, but not before that. Or shachas almanas logus v'gozes. Once again, Rabbi Yehuda is mekil, and he says that animal fodder, you're allowed to sell it to an idol worshiper, and the condition that you set down is that he cut it down. Same machlokas appears a third time, and we'll see why we need three times. Kama almanas liktzar v'kotzer, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda allows you to sell grains on the condition that it be cut down and harvested. And Rabbi Meir holds a mochrim el ktsutza. You got to cut it down before the mechira. You cannot rely on the condition. Utricha, I need all three. Now, this utricha is going to go in both directions. It's going to tell me why, if I only had this case in Rabbi Meir, I would not know what Rabbi Meir would say about another case. Maybe he's modus Rabbi Yehuda, and vice versa. So let's go through it all. De'iyashmin and Elon, if we only had the case of the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda regarding selling a tree on the condition that the guy will cut it down, Bahakam Rabbi Meir doesn't trust the guy because came into the posid mashile, the idol worshiper is not going to be interested in cutting down the tree immediately. What does he gain by that? And therefore, we have to suspect the possibility that the idol worshiper is going to hold on to the tree and therefore hold on to the land and feifter on it. He's not going to bother, fulfilling this condition. Aval high, but in the case of, let's say you have grains, if you leave them standing without harvesting them, they'll get ruined. Techimashile posid, I might think that Modulei Rabbi Yehuda would be right in this case, and Rabbi Meir would accept that we could rely on the guy. He doesn't have vested interest to leave the tree in the ground. In the case of the grain, he doesn't have vested interest in leaving the grain in the ground because the grain is going to be damaged if you leave it in the ground. Okay, now you have two chidushim to tell me that Rabbi Meir is machmir even in the case of grains. So why do you have to give me a third case of shachas? Mishum delo yediyah shiv. We believe that Rabbi Meir says he has no vested interest in. Just one second. Now we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda, right? Rabbi Yehuda was mekil because Rabbi Yehuda says, he'll fulfill the condition. He has no vested interest in letting it stand in the ground. Avol shachas. But in the case of green fodder, even Rabbi Yehuda would have to agree that the idea shivchayu, he understands the benefit of leaving it unharvested. It's 1/3 of its growth. The longer he leaves it in the ground, the better. And Amai might think, Modi lei Reb Meir, he would be Moda, that we have to suspect that the guy will not fulfill the condition. The Ashmini Baha, why didn't you just tell me the case of fodder? And I would know that if Rabbi Yehuda is mekil, even in the case of fodder, we have a vested interest to leave it in the ground, and certainly kol v'chomer in the other cases he'll be motiv v'hakom Rabbi Meir. Maybe I would think that Rabbi Meir would be machmir only in the case of fodder because the guy has vested interest in leaving it grow. Avol b'hanach, but in the case of a tree or in the case of the grains, where leaving it in the ground there's no visible benefit from that. Maybe he doesn't have to suspect the guy of leaving in the ground. The guy will indeed, like Rabbi Yehuda insists, fulfill that condition of the sale. Tzricha. The Gemara is a suffix behema menas lishchot mahu. Are you allowed to sell an animal to an oved kochavim on the condition that he slaughtered the animal? Well, let's go over the prohibition of selling livestock to an idol worshiper. Right, we said that the idol worshiper might use the livestock as a sacrifice to the idols, or alternatively, he might work that animal on Shabbos, and that'll lead you to a case of schirus where he rents the animal. But here he made a condition: I'm selling you this animal on the condition that you slaughter it. If he slaughters it, it's not going to work on Shabbos. And if he slaughters it, it's not going to be brought as a korban for the idols. Sometime in my shori, Rabbi Yehuda said that in those three cases of trees, grains, and animal fodder, why was he making the lad b'shusei kaim v'lo motzi mashiluhu? Right, the oved kochavim doesn't really have full ownership and possession over that which was sold to him because it was sold on the condition that he harvested, that he cut it down. I might think that Rabbi Yehuda would agree that you're not allowed to sell an animal to a god because now the animal is completely in the possession of the guy. The guy has total control over the animal. And maybe he's going to let it live. And instead of shechting it, he's going to allow it to live. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda should be molded to Rabbi Meir that we have to be afraid that he won't fulfill his condition and shech the animal. O dilma, lo shnosh, we say that makes a difference. Tashma, the sadi we learned in a brisa, behema, benas, lishchot, v'sholchet. If you sell an animal to an oved kochavim on the condition that he slaughter it, you're allowed to do so. Behema lenas lishchot v'sholchet. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, Omein Mochrin Lo El Shchuta. Once again, the same machlok stream of Meir Rabbi Yehuda applies. The Mishnah says at the bottom of Daf Chaf Amud Beis, Ein maskir lam batim be'Eretz Yisrael. We're not allowed to even rent houses to them in Eretz Yisrael. Now, I thought that in the case of rental, it might be prohibited because you violate lo sichanim, because if you hold schirus kanya, you remember we had a mechlokus where the schirus is kanya or not, so the guy acquires ownership over the land of Israel, and that's a violation of lo sichanim. However, that's not true, what I told you, even though I thought it was true. But the problem here is that if we rent houses to the idol worshippers, we might come to sell it to the Magi. Vein tzarich lo sados, and all this is in Eretz Yisrael because of Lo Sichanim. If we sell him a field, he owns part of Eretz Yisrael. Ubesuria, which is otherwise known as Aram Tzova, which is the area on the outlying borders of Eretz Yisrael, which was Kibush Yachid when David HaMelech conquered those lands on his own, meaning his own initiative, is there. It doesn't have the same status as Eretz Yisrael, because Kibush Yachid Lav Shmei Kibush. And here on the top of Chaf Aleph, Maskirin Lambatim Avolos Sodos. So it's a very strange halach that Aram Tzova is in the gray area, Nishtaher, Nishtahin. On the one hand, we're allowed to rent houses to idol worshippers in Syria, indicating that Syria does not have the status of Eretz Yisrael. But on the other hand, we're not allowed to rent them fields because of Lo Sichone, which seems to indicate that Syria has the status of Eretz Yisrael. Divrei Meir. So all this is Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir holds that Kibush Yachid Shmei Kibush. I'm sorry, what did I just say? Kibush Yachid Lav Shmei Kibush. So why do we prohibit renting them fields? And the answer is it might lead to selling them a field. In the case of selling a house in Syria, since it's not a violation of the Torah law of Lo Sichana, because Kibush Yachid Lav Shmei Kibush, and Aram Tzova was not sanctified with the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, it's only B'Darabanan. So to make another Gzeira and say, well, we can't rent a house out to a guy in Syria, that's too far. But, right, you're not let us, right, you're not allowed to rent a house because it might lead to selling a house. But as far as renting a field in Syria, Rabbi Meir prohibits it, even though you're allowed to sell a field in Syria to a guy. But the fear was that if you rent out a field in Syria to an idol worshiper, that would lead to renting fields in Eretz Yisrael. So I'm not sure exactly why it was so common to rent out fields, that if you rent out a field to an idol worshiper on the borders of Eretz Yisrael, even though it's outside the borders, you might come to rent out a field inside the borders, but selling houses was not that common. And Rabbi Meir holds there was no fear that if we allow and permit him to sell a house to an idol worshiper in Syria, he'll come to sell a house to a guy in Eretz Yisrael. So all that is Rabbi Meir, and Mitzvah tomorrow we'll see the Bar Plukta Rabbi Meir is Rabbi Yossi at the end of this Mishnah on Daf Chaf Al.